In February of 22, I laid out a hypothesis for the damage to hearts. Remember, myocarditis means inflammation. Inflammation is a symptom of heart damage. And we have since seen quite a number of pieces of evidence about things related to this damage. But anyway, it's become a central focus because it is the most obvious form of damage that results from these vaccines. And so there's been a lot of battling back and forth over what it does and doesn't mean, how it compares to COVID itself, etc. But the hypothesis that I first deployed in February of 22, that we revisited in our last live stream, and compares, it is a distinct mechanism from the one Paul Offit lays out, suggests that the vaccines, by their very nature, will result in the cells that translate the mRNAs into proteins. I don't know why. Proteins. Any cell that translates these mRNA messages into proteins is going to be targeted by the immune system, which will incorrectly regard them as virally infected because they are putting out the signature of a virally infected cell. The signature of a virally infected cell being that it has molecules that look like your own molecules and it has molecules that look foreign. Any cell that gives that signal is suggesting to the immune system that it is virally infected, and destroying it is, while bad, the best thing to do, because that cell, if it is virally infected, is not going to become uninfected.
It's making the best of a bad situation so far as the immune system can see.
Right. Now, a paper emerged this week, and I don't know whether this is just a simple coincidence or whether Offit was trying to seed the world with the idea that the problem was the spike protein molecular structure looking like heart muscle proteins, or not. It could be just a coincidence, or it could be mere coincidence, or it could be meaningful. Maybe he was trying to get ahead of this paper that was going to emerge in Science Immunology, which is a high-profile, top-tier journal. And so, Zach, do you want to show the paper? Cytokinopathy with aberrant cytotoxic lymphocytes and profibric myeloid response in SARS-CoV-2 mRNA vaccine-associated myocarditis. And what this paper does is it looks at the pathology in people who are experiencing myocarditis following mRNA vaccination for COVID, and it analyzes at the level of the cellular and molecular environment in which the myocarditis is happening. It analyzes the various components in order to test competing hypotheses about what might be causing this pathology. And so what I'm proposing to do is to go through, I think we should go, there's a little paragraph that has been inserted that describes the work, and then there is the abstract of the work, which summarizes the work. The authors themselves summarize the work in the abstract as a standard scientific process.
I don't have, in the official PDF of the paper, I don't have the lay abstract.
The lay abstract. But I think we should go through the real abstract. And I will say, I did take a course in immunobiology many years ago. I speak immunobiology for this reason, but I'm not fluent in it, and I'm not current in it. This is, what I learned in immunobiology has stood the test of time. It's high quality stuff, and among the best things I did as an undergraduate was taking this course. It has paid back dividends each and every year since. I learned a tremendous amount. But anyway, I'm going to use what I understand to try to translate as much of this abstract as possible, and you will see the relevance to this question raised by Offit and his proposal, and my proposal from February of 22, which is now finally getting some traction. Okay, the abstract says, and you will help me if I screw it up, because there are a lot of complex technical terms here. Rare immune-mediated cardiac tissue inflammation can occur after vaccination, including after SARS-CoV-2 mRNA vaccines. Now, they have to say rare because you have to kowtow to the appropriate gods on this. You can't possibly be caught in a major journal like this admitting that the injuries from these vaccines are actually shockingly common.
Yeah, most of the abstracts we have seen that have in any way found damage associated with these vaccines have ended with a sentence that is something to the effect of, but despite all of this, it is still necessary that everyone go out and get vaccinated right away. Right. So this does not have that, but it begins with rare.
It has to say that. And
Somewhere,
then somewhere you hear an echo across the academy where everyone goes, Amen. Right? Okay. However, the underlying immune, cellular, and molecular mechanisms driving this pathology remain poorly understood. Here, we investigated a cohort of patients who developed myocarditis and or pericarditis, and I should say myocarditis is inflammation of the heart itself. Pericarditis is inflammation of the pericardium, which is the sac in which the heart sits. So these are both heart-associated inflammation, but in a slightly different tissue.
Yeah, I mean,
With elevated troponin, you've heard us mention troponin recently in the study that we covered that John Campbell had covered, where instead of waiting for people to walk in with some sort of a pathology that caused them to seek medical help, they simply assessed troponin levels in people who had been vaccinated and found them in something like 1 in 35 people, indicating an awful lot of damage that's subclinical, that doesn't cause you to seek attention from a doctor, but is enough that it's measurable in your blood.
but I'm sure it'll be fine.
It'll be just fine, of course. Amen. B-type natriuretic peptide and C-reactive protein levels, as well as cardiac imaging abnormalities shortly after SARS-CoV-2 mRNA vaccination. So these are just markers that they're using. Yeah. Contrary to early hypotheses, patients did not demonstrate features of hypersensitivity myocarditis, nor did they have exaggerated SARS-CoV-2 specific neutralizing antibody responses consistent with hyperimmune humoral mechanisms.
Specific or neutralizing antibody responses.
So this is going to take a little unpacking, but what they're saying is people have suggested that there might be some folks who, I think this is what they're saying. Some folks may have sensitivities which make them prone to myocarditis, and they may be just simply triggered by this vaccine. They don't see evidence of that. Mm-hmm. They also say that there's no evidence with hyperimmune humoral mechanisms. Now, what they're talking about here, humoral mechanisms are not entirely limited to, but they are primarily talking about antibodies of the kind that you have heard overly focused upon with discussions of these COVID vaccines. What they're saying is we do not see an overabundance of SARS-CoV-2 antibodies causing the heart to be inflamed. Okay, so they are ruling out these proposals. We additionally found no evidence of cardiac targeted antibodies. Autoantibodies. This is what Paul Offit was suggesting, right? That autoimmune antibodies created because the spike protein mimicked what he said was the heavy chain of the actin molecule in the hearts would result in those antibodies being findable. They didn't find them. Instead, unbiased systematic immune serum profiling revealed elevations in circulating interleukins of a number of different kinds, chemokines of a number of different kinds, and matrix metalloproteases.
Metalloproteases. I don't know the significance of those second two classes of molecules.
These are enzymes. I don't know much about it. So they're saying they didn't find them. Subsequent deep immune profiling using single-cell RNA repertoire sequencing of peripheral blood mononuclear cells during acute disease revealed expansion of activated CXCR3 cytotoxic T cells and NK cells. Now, this is where the rubber meets the road, and I realize that was not a sentence to make you think anything important had happened, but what they're saying...
Well, no. I mean, many people would read that sentence and say, I have no idea what's going on here. Maybe there's something important here, but I can't interpret it.
So NK is natural killer.
Yes.
Cytotoxic T cells, these are T cells that kill your own cells.
Also sort of colloquially called killer T cells.
Yep. Both phenotypically resembling cytokine-driven killer cells. Now, what they're saying is inflammation, and actually people who listen to the Umberto Meduri Paul Merrick podcast, which I highly recommend, we'll maybe come back to it later, will remember a discussion that we had in there about the fact that inflammation is part of the body's adaptive response to disease, and that it gets away from us for various reasons. And that's when it's pathological. It's not that inflammation is inherently bad. It's part of the immune response. But then it can get away from you, which is where things become serious. But what they say is that you've got cytokine, you've got these cytotoxic T cells, natural killer cells, both phenotypically resembling cytokine-driven killer cells. So what they're describing is they are peering into the process of so-called vaccine-induced myocarditis, and they are finding the body reacting as if it is fending off an infection in the heart, exactly as I proposed. Mm-hmm. Yep. In addition, patients displaying signatures of inflammatory and profibric CCR2 and CD163 plus monocytes coupled with elevated serum-soluble CD163 that may be linked to late gadolinium enhancement or cardiac MRI. So they're talking about something that they're seeing, they're looking into these hearts with magnetic resonance imaging, and they're seeing pathologies that are grossly evidenced. These are not molecular level pathologies, but they're seeing them, which can
a lot of specifics here that are going to be inside baseball, even for us with regard to what are the indicators that are useful, since by and large you cannot detect damage directly. So what we're seeing here is a lot of proxies for damage measured a lot of different ways.
A lot of
different proxies, a lot of different measurements.
But they say, so that last sentence, we go back to the beginning of it. In addition, patients displayed signatures of inflammatory and profibrotic profibrotic, which means this is basically scar tissue formation. That's what that means. And so what we're talking about is not, okay, this patient had a transient inflammation of the heart, which went away, and thank goodness they got away with it, and now they can go back to life. The point is they lost capacity in the heart. This is not proven, but what they're saying is we see a pathology that is consistent with a heart damaged by natural killer cells and cytotoxic T cells, in which scarring is the best repair that can be made. Mm-hmm. So that heart is now damaged for life. It now scars in the best case, and this person is now vulnerable to things like arrhythmias. They are less capable than they once were, and this is a potentially life-shortening pathology. Right,
and so let me, I know we're not done with the abstract yet. You're in the middle here still, but you mentioned, this is therefore not transient. How then have they been getting away with calling the myocarditis and the pericarditis transient in so many cases? In part, and some of this will no doubt be intentional, but much of it will probably be utterly unintentional, because doctors, like everyone in any field, will often conflate the underlying thing with the thing that they are measuring and imagine that they are the same. If what you are measuring is inflammation in its acute phase, that acute inflammation will indeed be transient. And so then you take that conclusion out into the world and say, yes, damage, wow, are bad, but it's over and done with after a while, because we can't see it anymore, can we? So the thing that is being measured is indeed transient, but there was never any reason to conclude, therefore, that the damage that that inflammation was indicating would be transient as well.
Right. So it's a little bit like if you had a building collapse and you detected it by the dust that was kicked up. The dust might clear, but it doesn't put the building back up, right? So anyway, they're using proxies, which is frankly what you just simply have.
That's a great analogy.
What you have to do with all of this stuff,
right?
Because we're dealing with mechanisms inside a living person, and it's difficult to assess.
Right, but I think I just want to point to the media that grabbed onto this. Like, it's transient, it's fine. The it's fine thing was their conclusion, based on a misunderstanding, in part because of the misunderstanding of the people actually doing the research, of what transient is a reference to. Transient is not a reference to the damage. Transient is a reference to the particular thing that was measured as an indicator of the damage. And so whenever you see any of these conclusions being trotted out in the media, you have to wonder, what actually are you talking about? right? Like transient in this case is true. And people will, go to their graves saying, no, but it's transient. It's like, yes, but the thing that's transient isn't anything worth talking about, actually. That the only reason we're talking about that is because that was what was measurable. And, the map is not the territory at some level.
Remember the Spin Doctors?
The group, the
band.
Like 1990s
Yeah.
band.
Had a great album.
Yeah.
The Spin Doctors were named after a phenomenon that was very real called Spin Doctors. Spin Doctors were people who went, I believe, to presidential debates and maybe other things. And they were there in the room, ready. They were listening to the debate. And if their candidate, the one they had been hired to protect, screwed up, they would immediately lodge in the room of people who were trying to figure out how they were going to report the story. They would lodge the interpretation that minimized the damage or flipped it into a win or whatever. Now, the idea is, okay, how are we going to take the dire fact of these radically novel transfection agents producing heart damage? How are we going to get the blue team faithful to all, look down their noses at people who are concerned and say, you're obviously a right-wing nut job. Everyone knows the myocarditis is... and then transient is going to be the way they're going to spin this very devastating indictment of that technology into something that no reasonable person could worry about. That's what they did. All right. So let's just finish this out here. Together, our results demonstrate upregulation of inflammatory cytokines and corresponding lymphocytes with tissue-damaging capabilities, suggesting a cytokine-dependent pathology, which may further be accompanied by myeloid cell-associated cardiac fibrosis. What they're saying is, what we see is a reaction consistent with the body damaging its own heart. Why would it do that? Because it's programmed to fend off viruses if they get in there. As bad as heart damage is, an infected heart is worse. So that's what they see is a pattern consistent with that results then in cell-associated cardiac fibrosis. That is to say, scarring, which is the best case. It's bad, but it's the best case. These findings likely rule out some previously proposed mechanisms of mRNA vaccine-associated myopericarditis and point to new ones with relevance to vaccine development and clinical care. So what that means is the Offutt mechanism that he proposed last week, I don't know if he proposed it before that, is not consistent with the findings that they made. And what is consistent, they say that this is a new proposal or a new set of observations, but the point is you ought to notice that new set of observations is consistent with a hypothesis that we put together on camera on DarkHorse.
Can I just share a couple of excerpts from the end of the paper first? Because we're probably not going to come right back to this paper. The very end of the discussion of the paper. On the basis of our findings, longitudinal clinical monitoring of vaccine-associated myopericarditis patients may be warranted to assess potential persistence of cardiac abnormalities. Yes. Then in the same paragraph.
Yeah, and may be warranted is...
Then in the same paragraph, future studies building on the translational relevance of our work will be important to further optimize the excellent safety profile of mRNA vaccines among specific demographic subgroups.
Amen.
Amen. Right. Now, they do, specific demographic subgroups, that, it is becoming acceptable, nay, it will be required soon to reflect back and say, yes, maybe we shouldn't have been vaccinating the young men after all are bad, right? Like that is becoming the thing that is now not only acceptable, but necessary. And this specific demographic subgroups is the nod to that future orthodoxy. But will we ever get to a legitimate orthodoxy in which there is widespread understanding that, as you are saying, and this is where I'm going to just hand it right back to you, actually, these were not ready. These were not ready. They couldn't have possibly been ready. This platform is not ready, and no one should have gotten it.
Yeah, nowhere near ready.
Right.
But, look, I don't want to say anything negative about these authors. My guess is these authors faced a problem. They did good work. It successfully advances the ball in terms of how much we know. This now goes out of the realm of hypothesis. We now have a mechanism that appears is now the presumptive mechanism, right? We know what it is, and we now know what it implies. And frankly, that's hugely important. But the fact that they have to riddle this piece of excellent work with, various incantations designed to placate various powerful gods is absurd. And that last one
probably wouldn't have gotten published in Science Immunology, but for those nods to the orthodoxy.
Right. And the orthodoxy is, I don't like the term evil, but if you're going to take a radical, dangerous technology like this, and you're going to claim that it's only really bad for certain demographics, young, healthy men, like, that's not a certain demographic. And what's more, the paper that we talked about either last week or the week before that found the 1 in 35 vaccinated people had elevated troponin levels, it was actually women who were more commonly showing this sign. Mm-hmm. So, hey, we don't know how extensive the damage is, and these aren't limited subgroups. Healthy young men is that a demographic that half the population is supposed to pass through?
You can talk about demographic groups and know that there are some, who they are intending to keep in the line of fire for these and future mRNA vaccines is older and immune-compromised people and people who otherwise have comorbidities that put them at particular risk for whatever the pathogen is that we're talking about.
No, I'm sorry, I'm pushing back, because the very sentence, I think it was the same sentence, they say, optimize the excellent safety profile. Mm-hmm. Yep. What in God's name does that mean? These things.
That's why I read it, but I don't think specific demographic subgroups is a legitimate way to understand populations. We know we were talking about, as were some other people, the need to risk stratify both our understanding of COVID and our understanding of the mRNA vaccines as they were being trotted out. And almost no one was doing it. And that was part of why you got, parents living, scared parents living in scared fear until they could get their tiny children vaccinated with so-called vaccines that were at much more risk of doing damage to their children than the virus ever would. Right? Risk stratification is a massively important thing that we need to be talking about.
Risk stratification is great, but when you have a novel technology that is a threat to a huge fraction of the population, and then you minimize it by talking about demographic groups, instead of saying, actually, we don't know how big a threat this is, and we don't know if we're noticing it in young, healthy people because it gets obscured by the pathologies that older, unhealthy people tend to have anyway. So the point is this. They're just way ahead of what we understand, and they're using language to minimize it, and that's not cool. That said, again, the authors did excellent work, and they got it into a high-profile, top-tier publication, and these are compromises they may have had to do, and I don't judge them for that.